What are you concerned about happening in the next few days?
Well, we are stuck in an unresolvable bind. Traps have been set. And I know that probably sounds preposterous and hyperbolic, but it isn't. I am very hesitant to say it seems to be going towards Trump.
Why is that?
Because what it does is cheat all the time. In every way it can get away with it.
How does one drain the swamp?
It's a good question. I think the first thing you do is, at the same time we're playing nuclear games with Russia and Ukraine, this is insane. We don't know who the president is. What we have here is quite literally a paradigm in which the executive branch has granted itself the power to declare anybody a terrorist for any reason, and having done so, one's constitutional rights evaporate.
Last night at a private dinner, you gave what I consider quite a black pill presentation of how you see things unfolding, not just after the election, but actually in these few days before the election. I wondered if you'd re-present those now to viewers and listeners.
Sure.
Before you hear from Professor Weinstein, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I'm going to have more fascinating guests like Bret discussing the issues that you at home want to talk about and the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Professor Bret Weinstein. Professor Bret Weinstein, I've been following you for a long time, ever since the Evergreen scandal, and I've been a huge admirer. So it's great to we met last night for the first time, and it's great to finally get to speak to you in this kind of scenario. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you have many requests, and so it means a lot to me that you would speak to me. Thank you.
Well, I'm really happy to do it, and I've been hoping to meet you for quite some time. There has been an apocalypse in music where virtually every single person that we have listened to and admired has fallen down on the job. And anyway, as a musician who has paid a price for your principles, I have admired you for quite some time and have been hoping to meet. So I'm glad we finally have.
Thank you. Rage for the machine is what happens. I think that's a topic for another day, although it might be linked to what we discussed today. What I want to ask you, and we'll go straight into it, with less than a week out from the presidential election, last night at a private dinner, you gave what I consider quite a black pill presentation of how you see things unfolding, not just after the election, but actually in these few days before the election. And I wondered if we could dive into that, discuss that today. And I wondered if you'd re-present those now to viewers and listeners.
Sure, with one caveat.
Mm-hmm.
We are stuck in an unresolvable bind, which is there's lots of stuff that we have to discuss, that adults will responsibly want to discuss, that we are also unable to discuss completely openly because traps have been set. And I know that probably sounds preposterous and hyperbolic, but it isn't. In the U.S., we have a rogue, runaway deep state. Actually, you have it in Britain too. The Five Eyes has taken what we sometimes call the deep state and made it supranational. But what we have here is quite literally a paradigm in which the executive branch has granted itself the power to declare anybody a terrorist for any reason, and having done so, one's constitutional rights evaporate. Now, that's not really possible within the confines of our Constitution, but the loophole that they have granted themselves involves no ability to test this in court. So,
you're referring, this is the DOD's recent policy?
No, the DOD recently, actually it was the Department of Homeland Security recently tipped their hand that they were thinking in these terms over the course of COVID with their memo declaring mis, dis, and malinformation kinds of terrorism. Terrorism used to be a word that we used to convey a concept. It is now a magical legal term that alleviates you of your constitutional rights on the sole discretion of the executive branch. That predicament is something that arose in the aftermath of 9/11 and was brought into full focus by Barack Obama's signing of the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, which had two provisions in it that set up this onerous state of affairs. So we live under that regime. Most Americans are completely unaware of it. But what it means in the context of an election like this is that our normal constitutional rights to speak freely about hypothetical scenarios puts us in danger of being declared terrorist behind our backs without our knowledge, without our ability to review the evidence against us or attempt to refute it. And so anyway, I will be a little bit careful in what I say, not because I think this is a moment in which, people should be careful. I think we should be very open. And to the extent that there are possibilities that some of us are worried about that we needn't worry about, let's put them on the table and discuss why they're not a problem and do away with them. But the bind where we never know at what point we hit the tripwire is something that should be on the mind of people who are thinking about the possibilities.
English audience will understand this very well because that's already happened and unfolded. If anything, England and what's happened since Sir Keir Starmer's come to become our Prime Minister is an example to America of what is around the corner.
Right. And many of us believe, I think, quite credibly, that the difference between your system and our system is that our Constitution is more robust than the documents that protect your rights, and most importantly, probably the Second Amendment makes it harder to impose tyranny on the American public than the British public.
I'd like to come back to the Second Amendment, but
sure,
you don't sound so, despite that constitutional protection, you don't sound so safe by it.
I watched what happened to the Constitution in the aftermath of 9/11, so I'm aware that the constitutional rights that we had are no longer constitutional rights. They are constitutional privileges, and for most people, they are still more or less in effect. So this is what I call surgical totalitarianism, right? You build a system in which most people are unmolested. You only impose your constraints on those tiny number of people who are in a position to make a substantial difference. And this results in a disconnect where the people who are facing these threats are well aware of them. And when they try to talk about the effect that's having on our ability to move society in a reasonable direction, it falls on deaf ears because most people can't feel it.
Mm-hmm. So in real terms, as far as you're prepared to talk about it, what are you concerned about happening in the next few days?
Well, it's not really the next few days. I'm aware that the rules change based on where we are in this process. And if there's one thing I know about what we call the deep state, it's that the deep state is keenly aware of these transitions in the rules and therefore the alteration in its option set. When I talk to other members of the public about the changes in the rules, most people have never thought about them. Mm-hmm. For example, the difference between what happens if a presidential candidate, let's say Donald Trump, were assassinated prior to the election versus after the election. After the election, his vice president would take the office. Before the election, his party would choose the nominee. What happens now that the American electoral system has changed into one in which voting is done over a long period of time? I can't even tell you. If the rules say that the Republican Party gets to choose the nominee, but many people have already voted for somebody who was on their printed ballot, I'm not sure what happens. But in any case, the fact that each time something formally changes, the flowchart of possibilities is radically altered in a way that the public is not aware of, that concerns me.
Which could seed enough chaos to upend the election, which seems to be going towards Trump.
I am very hesitant to say it seems to be going towards Trump.
Why is that?
Because the quality of our information has been driven almost to noise. The quality of the signal that we get is so dependent on filters that we know nothing about that it is perfectly possible to believe something based on what seems like an overwhelming data set, and to find out that there are reasons that that data set was not representative. And we, of course, saw this when Hillary Clinton failed to win an election that everybody believed she was going to win handily. Mm-hmm. So I do, if you ask me what I think is going to happen, I think Donald Trump is going to be elected. And I even think that the margin is large enough that we might know right away, which is not something that happens anymore in American presidential elections. But if that does not come to pass, am I going to be shocked? No, it's going to be yet another case in which what seemed obvious didn't unfold the way we expected.
Yeah, we've seen it. This is kind of my opinion is we saw them cheating not only in 2020, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the cover up, that being one of the most famous examples, but even in this election, we've seen how Google results are manipulating the people. I don't see why the Democratic establishment machine won't cheat. That's kind of my opinion. So even if Trump gets a popular vote victory, I don't see why the Democrats would stop them from trying to manipulate the results in another way.
So let me just say, I remain a Democrat. I don't vote for them anymore. I believe that this party is like a family pet that has become rabid, and the party now needs to be put down because it is a lethal hazard to the republic and frankly, much beyond the republic, to the world, really. What it does is cheat all the time. In every way it can get away with it, and sometimes in ways that it only marginally gets away with it. It cheats, and it isn't terribly concerned that we know that. It is concerned that we can't prove it, and part of the way it cheats is by biasing venues so that proof is out of reach even when something is obvious. But no, it's been cheating for the entire electoral cycle. It will continue to cheat. That doesn't mean that there will be tampering at the level of the ballot box, but I've become fond of the idea I wouldn't put it past them, right? There's nothing morally stopping them from doing that. The only question is a technical one. Can they get away with it at a level that they're comfortable with? But no, they will cheat. But I don't know that cheating in this case, it may be that the Democratic Party has fielded such a weak candidate that it has reverted to a plan B, in which it would rather play defense in ways that it has massive advantages that we are incapable of monitoring, than to play offense from the office of the president. I don't know. But I do know that whatever it is that has taken up cheating at this level is hostile to the American people, and it is hostile to the long-term well-being of the republic. It is using it as a tool. So
one case against that might be to make the case that there is a robust system in the Supreme Court, and that I guess you would say the military at least is red. And so is there no sense for you that there's enough buttressing of power or enough balance of power with other non-blue institutions in America?
Too many wild cards. So I used to believe, I've been a student of history. I think about a category, the tragedies of history. And my concern is that the decay in the experiment that was the United States and the modern West, the decay of that experiment puts us on track to join the list of great tragedies of history. And it's something that anybody who understands what those chapters were about should wish to avoid in the strongest possible terms. So I'm always tracking what it is that makes those things more likely, what makes them less likely. And I must say I was caught off guard by the degree to which the various crimes surrounding COVID set us up for such a tragedy. So I used to think what would happen is the immoral orders would be handed down, and the military would likely divide over them. There would be those who would not follow immoral orders, would not go after fellow Americans, and there would be those who would follow them, and that at least set up a battle that was likely winnable. The public plus whatever fraction of the military wasn't going to accept immoral orders, that's a ferocious power. But COVID successfully purged the military of exactly the sorts of people who resist immoral orders, because immoral orders were, of course, given, right? We had to vaccinate the entire military, which was an insane thing to do. The military is disproportionately young and healthy. There, therefore, was nothing, even in the theoretical case, to be gained by vaccinating them against COVID, and yet we vaccinated across the board. So why would we have done this? That's a matter we can speculate on. But what's the consequence is the kinds of people who say, hey, wait a minute, that's not an order that should have been given. Those people are now not in the military, which is why our Second Amendment is so important, because the fact that they're not in the military doesn't mean they're not armed.
Okay, I'd like to ask about the Second Amendment before coming back to the election specifically. And this is as an outsider, so forgive me if I offend the American feeling of. I know it's such a precious amendment to you, but it seems to me that even in a normal scenario, I hear all the time the First Amendment is protected by the Second Amendment. First Amendment of government not to intervene in free speech of citizens. Second Amendment, the right to carry a gun. I don't actually see a scenario where practically speaking, having a gun will save you from the government coming after you. As you've started this very conversation describing the way in which you can be labeled a terrorist and it's game over.
Yep.
Practically speaking, just because you have a gun, you're not actually going to be able to defeat the government. And even in the scenario that the 80 million people in America who have guns somehow came together, I don't see how that would ever defeat the US government.
It's not really a question of defeating them. First of all, the history of recent wars tells us that an outgunned force often does succeed because of the risk aversion of the power in question. So let me give you an analogy. When I lived in Portland, when Heather and I were there, we were surrounded by coyotes, and the coyotes were notorious for capturing and killing house cats. We now live in a place with no coyotes, and we have foxes, lots of them. The foxes do not go after house cats. That is not because a fox cannot kill a house cat. It's because the cost of killing a house cat is very high for an animal the size of a fox. So it is not that the cat is capable of winning. It's that the cat is capable of driving the price of losing up, or the price of winning for the fox up to a level that it's not worth engaging in. So my point would be, we are already seeing, why is it the United States and the British government are united in the Five Eyes Alliance? Why is it that your right to speak is in such worse condition than mine? The reason probably has to do with the fact that we do have this 1-2 punch. The First Amendment grants us this right in unambiguous terms, and the Second Amendment creates a credible threat if somebody decides to use power to override the First Amendment. So can I say for sure that that's what's going on? No, but it's hard to find a competing hypothesis. So this is also presumably why the battle over firearms. And I should tell you, I grew up as a gun control advocate. I had a standard left-wing position on this. I thought the Second Amendment was a tremendous error made by the Founding Fathers because they couldn't anticipate the ferociousness of the weapons that we would have at our disposal. I believed all of that stuff. I now don't believe that stuff. And the more one looks into the matter, the more nuanced and fascinating the case becomes. But the battle has now centered around something called assault weapons. Assault weapons are a nebulous term used to paint a level of weaponry as useless in defense, right? Assault is an offensive term. Why is it that the blue team is so focused on relieving us of our quote-unquote assault weapons? And it is because those weapons, though they are less powerful than their military equivalent, are powerful enough to create a problem where a military crackdown on the American public would not be simple.
Okay, so back to this election. What do you think might happen between the election and whenever it is in January that the transfer of power happens, in both the scenario of a Kamala victory and of a Trump victory?
Well, again, I think our information set is garbage. So what I expect to happen, I expect with low confidence. my actual expectation is that we will not see fireworks during the election. We will see something that looks like unrest no matter what happens in the election. But that we will get to January 20th and see an inauguration. But again, if something wildly different happened, I won't be shocked, because I believe all possibilities have been considered by teams that do not have a patriotic obligation to follow the rule of law.
Mm-hmm. So some sort of chaos is your sense?
Well, you could imagine a lot of scenarios. You could imagine something like January 6th, where some hot-headed group is induced to behave in an unacceptable way, and this is used as a pretext to persecute some much larger group of people with a reasonable concern. So
I'm always astounded by the double standard in this country from the outside. And forgive me again, I know Americans don't like hearing British people talk about their country, but
I don't mind.
You mentioned January 6th, and you're from Portland. I remember following very closely the insurrection that happened there at the Portland courthouse.
For 100 consecutive nights.
There were federal officers inside the building whilst quote-unquote protesters, as Nancy Pelosi would call them, were trying to burn the building down.
Yeah.
And I don't see that being used by the Republicans. It seems that is it's going to double. There's different rules for the different teams here.
Every single aspect of this comes down to a double standard. That's just simply what it is. It's discretionary prosecution. And so, you can certainly make an argument that an attack on the courthouse in Portland is not the same as an attack on the Capitol building in Washington. I agree. They're not the same. But the idea that in one case you have federal officers restraining themselves absurdly over the course of 100 consecutive nights of violent rioting. And in the case of what happened in Washington, you have federal officers participating in inducing. So, I'm not happy about January 6th. No part of it makes me happy. I think the protest was unwise. I think the portrayal of it is absurd. I think the participation of the federal government in ways that we know and ways that seem apparent but are harder to establish is deeply concerning and anti-patriotic. But nonetheless, we should learn the lesson of it. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason, certainly when I talk to people on what I guess I should call the red team, I don't really think of it as the Republican side anymore.
That means something different now. It sort of evokes old Republican. This red team is a very broad coalition with MAGA is different to Republican and
totally. Yeah. Well, I think what happened is Donald Trump decapitated the Republican Party, and the Republican Party still exists, but it isn't synonymous with MAGA. And frankly, MAGA isn't synonymous with the coalition that has now started marching under that banner. So that's a brand new phenomenon, and I'm very hesitant to use any of the older terms for it. I also don't recognize the Democratic Party as the party it was. So I do tend to think in terms of the blue and the red team. But if you talk to people who are currently under the red banner, it's amazing how careful and thoughtful they are. They're aware that the standard is a double standard and that they are going to be held to account in ways that people on the other side wouldn't be. So anyway, I'm glad that awareness is dawning because, okay, it's a double standard. You can say, I don't respect it, and no one should. But to understand that a game is supposed to involve the same rules applied to both sides. This is a slanted playing field, but just because the playing field is slanted doesn't mean that you should say, well, I'm going to play it as if it isn't. If you're on the downhill side of the slanted playing field, you have to play better.
Mm-hmm. It seems on the issue of chaos, if Trump wins, we talk about Portland here, and I'm reminded of his first presidency, and you had you had the BLM riots, Antifa, the Me Too movement. I even say the DEI. I saw all of these things as a reaction to Trump. If Trump wins, do you suspect that there will be a reemergence of, I don't think it's quite right to call it a woke pushback, but this sort of chaotic pushback in America, a rise again? I mean, relative to when Trump was president, Biden's presidency within America has been calmer because there's been less protest from the people.
I will expect something of that stripe, but it has become less plausible. The fact is, when Trump took office, there were a great many of us who were deeply uncomfortable with his ascendancy to that position. And I believe there was reason to be uncomfortable. I also believe we owe him a debt of gratitude because his political genius was required to break the stranglehold that the duopoly held on power. So there was no mechanism for getting past the Democratic and Republican parties other than something Trump-like, and there aren't many choices. That said, I think as much as there are positive aspects to his presidency, which is actually something that's hard to say about most modern presidencies. Each one seems to be worse than the last, and Trump seems to have broken that pattern. But the Trump administration suffered from a handicap, which is that it was built to win a rigged game. It was therefore not well constructed to govern in the aftermath of that. And so there's lots of failure to take advantage of the opportunity that they had garnered. Now, my hope is that Trump is a different guy now, that he has learned that lesson, and that the coalition of people who are now supporting him, including me, is broader and more capable. That, you know, you really had renegades who were ready to tolerate the slanders and participate in a mudslinging fest. And at the moment, what you have is a vast coalition of highly capable people who are ready to do the job and to admit their allegiance. And that's a much better position to govern from. So I'm very much hoping that that happens. But I see the danger that the deep state and all of the factions that it is so closely tied to cannot afford for Trump to be inaugurated and to start cleaning house. That's an existential threat to a force that has arranged a state in which it cannot be controlled by anything.
Yeah, I see this, your movement to rescue the republic, it's almost like it's taking over where Bernie left off. It's the left populists uniting with the right populists. And I see it all as a populist movement. Now, in 2016, Trump, his slogan was drain the swamp.
Yep.
And as soon as he came to power, he started putting JP Morgan bankers in, and it was the opposite of what the people who wanted him to drain the swamp, it was the opposite policy.
Yep.
It does seem this time his coalition, yourself, I would say, an important part of that, although not maybe officially, you have people like RFK Jr., who wants to drain the health swamp, or the lobbyist swamp. Vivek has been talking about the deep state. He's surrounded by people who aren't using the term drain the swamp anymore.
Right.
But their philosophy is drain the swamp. So practically speaking, and maybe this is too big a question, or maybe we can focus in on one specific area. How does one drain the swamp?
It's a good question. I think the first thing you do is, if you're Trump, you realize that the actual game you're playing is one in which you want history to reflect positively on what you did. Trump, at the moment, is very focused on winning an election, which will vindicate him in many ways. But the real vindication comes if he successfully governs and puts the ship of state back on a reasonable course, that would make him a historic president, right? An important person in American history. If he wants that, the best thing he can do is recognize that the presidency is not a superhero position. It is a position in which your ability to delegate the right jobs to the right people, to listen to what they have to say, to use your insight to create a governing force. If he does that, what he has at his disposal is what I've called the dream team. He has every single person with capacity and integrity ready to go.
And competence.
Yeah, and competence. So what he should do is obvious. Whether that force has the power to outflank the deep state is unclear. Nobody knows. The deep state probably doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say there are also some questions. There are things. Imagine what the deep state has to be, and none of us really know. We see aspects of it, and we can infer other aspects, but we don't really know. I would say that the thing that defines it is that it has generated a mechanism, budgets that are black, which is to say outside of the control of those who ostensibly are in a position to defund efforts that are not desirable. So it has figured out how to fund itself, which means that it is not under the control of the other branches of government. It's effectively a fourth branch of government. However, it is also true that it must be quite vast. And in a vast body that no doubt is composed of many people who believe themselves to be on the right side of history, believe themselves to be doing things that are in the interest of the republic, there are bound to be factions. There are bound to be people who are uncomfortable with some of the powers that the deep state has availed itself of, and they may be working on our behalf. I don't know. But you could imagine that one of the dangers is that the deep state is divided over what should happen next, which could explain in part why we see the chaos in the Democratic Party that we see. Did they mean to pick such a weak candidate? That's a very odd thing for them to have done. It really created an unsolvable puzzle, because even if she does win now, it's hard to explain how that happened.
Yeah, quite. And an even weaker vice president. I'll come back to Kamala. I'm keen to ask your opinion on her specifically, but just again on the practical, let's say the deep state, you have hundreds of thousands of people working in there. There's the Elon Musk approach, which is you come in and you just clear it out, but that could be incredibly dangerous. And actually, because as you say, we don't know what exactly they're protecting and exactly what's going on. That could be quite foolish. So even in any one of these institutions, in 4 years, how do you turn around such a machine? I mean, can it even be done?
It depends. We don't even know what state it's in. It's possible that the deep state is, I'm tempted to say literally, but let's say it's ambiguous whether that term applies. It's possible that the deep state is senile. There's a process by which senility evolves, and the characteristics that cause it to evolve in a creature are not unlike the processes that unfold surrounding a governance structure. It's possible that the deep state is incapable of managing the mission that it has carved out for itself, and that what we will find is that you go after it and it gives way in a manner you don't expect, which frankly, it used to be said, never pick a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel, right? That's not true anymore, right? The New York Times is a joke. They literally buy ink by the barrel, right? Who is outflanking the New York Times? A bunch of podcasters. Some of them famously don't clean the podcast desk between shows. I mean, right? So ink by the barrel is no longer a standard that you can judge the strength of your opponent by. And I would say, I don't want to drag you too deep into the theoretical layer unless you want to go there, but there is a hybrid nature to the force that I call Goliath. Goliath is the force that opposes all meaningful change, right? It's a force that wants to stay in power. It wants to keep control of the properties that it has, and it doesn't want something new arising that's in a position to threaten it. That's Goliath. Goliath is not a conspiracy. It contains conspiracies, presumably numerous ones, but it also has an emergent component to it. There are people who are doing the bidding of Goliath who may not even realize what they're partnered with, right? So, you have journalists, for example, who discover that when they write a certain kind of story, that their life gets better, their paycheck gets bigger, their audience grows, and so they keep writing that story.
I suspect the majority of those who are part of Goliath don't realize they're part
of it. Have no idea.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works.
That's exactly how it works. But that is also an indicator, if you have a mind to see the theoretical implications of that, that tells us something very important about how to win. Okay. The conspiratorial part of Goliath is effectively conscious and capable of dealing with unexpected turns of events. The emergent part of Goliath is not, because it is, in this case, emergent is a synonym for evolved. And evolved creatures can be ferociously powerful in the context in which they evolved, and then you put them in some context that's new to them and they fumble. So the reason that we successfully broke the narrative engine when it came to COVID was that Goliath misunderstood what podcasts were. It did not understand why it needed to care, right? Because it owned so many powerful media properties that any message that it wanted to turn into history, it could just simply broadcast at such an amplitude, nobody could overwhelm it. But of course, that's nonsense. People begin to discount what comes through the New York Times or MSNBC, and they start listening to the strange set of people who come through Joe Rogan's man cave. And you know what? The production values are low. There's an awful lot of, fumbling about rather than well-produced scripts and all of that. But the point is, those are all hallmarks of authenticity, and you can evaluate what's being said yourself because, frankly, you hear Joe pushing back. There are questions you have. Maybe he asks them. Maybe he fails to. Maybe somebody else addresses it somewhere. And so the public just started tuning out the mainstream media and tuning in the do your own research.
Well, half the public. I'm not entirely convinced it's the whole public. Certainly, it seems America coming in again, it seems cleaved. It seems that there's two different realities that Americans are living in.
100%. And I'm not arguing that we won during COVID, but what we did was we prevented Goliath from winning. Goliath's narrative is shattered. Right? People are aware there are massive problems with the mRNA vaccines. They're aware that in my country, they're less aware than in your country, but they're aware that there are drugs that were not under patent that had positive effects, and they are keenly aware that the virus seems to have emerged from laboratory work, and therefore all of the costs that we suffered, lockdowns, masks, vaccine harms, all of that stuff is downstream of bad governance. So doesn't mean we won. You're right. There's a large percentage of the population that's still more or less in the dark, even if some of them really just won't admit what they know. They've stopped getting boosters because there's part of them that's aware of how dangerous they are, but they won't admit that they've switched sides. But nonetheless, Goliath's narrative is not alive anywhere. It's dead. So the message is, if you want to beat Goliath, the strategy is the same. You need to drag Goliath onto territory that he does not have experience with because he's not good at fighting on that territory. That's where our power disadvantage stops mattering, and our ability to understand where we are and what's actually taking place can put us in a good position.
Revolt of the podcasters.
It is. Unfortunately, though, Goliath learns, right?
Yeah.
You have to drag him onto territory he doesn't understand. He now understands at least that podcasts are potentially a decisive factor.
And he plays dirty.
He plays dirty, and so...
look what happened with the Trump-Rogan interview. It was 21 million views in the first 24 hours, probably more because the YouTube tallying is slow to register, so it might have been as much as double that. And that was even with it not searchable on Google.
Not searchable.
Or on YouTube, I should say.
Not trending. Yeah, exactly. So plays dirty, but also, I don't know how much you're aware of what was attempted with the World Health Organization this summer, but the World Health Organization, which I have always tuned out as some supranational, ineffective bureaucracy that it doesn't really matter what it's trying to do, it can't be effective at anything. Well, no. Something has decided that the supranational order is the place to make tyranny work because it evades all of the problems that are resident in whatever our founding documents might say about our rights. So there was an attempt to push through a set of rules that effectively, if you reran COVID with the WHO having the rules that it was trying to pass, we would have lost. There would have been nothing we could have done because it carved out the right to mandate medical treatments, including gene therapy, was actually literally written into the rules that it wanted. The ability to censor, to tell national governments that they have to censor citizens who are saying certain things, the ability to redistribute drugs around the world as they saw fit. So they could have neutralized ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine by deciding that equity required them to send those things to some far off land. They wrote the rules that would have allowed them to win COVID. And we caught on just in time to derail it. And we derailed almost the entire thing.
Who derailed it exactly?
The medical freedom movement started to alert people, hey, there's the set of regulations that is moving through the WHO that is going to be passed that basically carves out the ability to impose global totalitarianism. And although you're supposed to look at it and think it's so deadly boring, it's not worth your time, you really need to pay attention because what's in this document is terrifying.
Sorry for one small detail, but practically, how did you? Was that then you were able to influence Congress, the Senate, to not go through?
No.
How did that play out? Sorry, exactly.
The way it worked was those of us who gleaned what was afoot started to broadcast it to our audiences, which raised a lot of awareness. And as the documents in question were headed towards their final stage at the World Health Organization, we held a rally in Geneva, and what effectively happened is they passed the documents in question having defanged them. So they surrendered almost entirely, but saved face by passing something that nominally was the document. So it looked like we lost, but really we won. But the punchline to this is these people do not take no for an answer, and they're now trying to pass the very same powers through the UN. So anyway, it's a very frightening story, and I will tell you, it also contains one of the most powerful arguments for Donald Trump, which I essentially never hear from anybody, which is that Donald Trump pulled us out of the World Health Organization, and he should do it again when he takes office. This is a dangerous organization, largely private. It's largely a trade organization for pharma disguised as a public health agency. And anyway, pulling us out of it is a major benefit for the U.S. population and any other country that follows suit.
Yeah. Can I bring you back to the election? I want to ask you about a possible Kamala victory, a Democrat victory. Elon Musk says that he's saying exactly the same thing the Democrats are saying about Trump, that if it's not a victory, there will no longer be democracy here in America. Do you agree with him? Do you think a Democrat victory means that's the end of democracy in America?
I see it slightly differently, and my guess is if I said this to Elon, he would agree to the nuanced part of this. What we have is the decay of the democratic influence in our system. The consent of the governed is supposed to be the basis of the legitimacy of our government. And it has been weakening over time for my adult life, at least. There is still, or was in 2016, enough democratic power left in the system for something outside of control to take office. Donald Trump won the presidency. I don't believe that could possibly have been part of somebody's plan. That was something off the script, which is why it produced such an intense reaction. So we know that there was enough Democratic power for something wildly unusual to happen in 2016. We don't actually know that the erosion of the Democratic force in our system hasn't progressed to such a level that that's impossible in 2024. But many of us are betting that there's still enough power for this to work one more time. I wouldn't bet on it lasting another 4 years. In fact, the terror that the blue team and the deep state clearly feel about something unexpected inhabiting the office of the president is so great that should they gain another 4 years of executive power, they would certainly work to ensure that they will never face this frightening prospect again.
Do you think there's truth in the voter ID immigration argument that they're deliberately bringing in importing voters? I haven't been able to get my head around that story particularly. I mean, Elon's banging it regularly. Is that something you've examined?
I mean, I've certainly thought a lot about immigration. In fact, I went to Panama to look at the influx myself because I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
Your interview with Tucker on that issue was that story was fascinating.
Well, it was a shocking thing to see, and frankly, it matched a lot of what I'd been told, but what I'd been told made so little sense that it just needed to be witnessed in person. But there's something about the explanation that these people are being ushered in for the purpose of having them vote that has never resonated for me. That said, there's a strong piece of evidence in support of it, which is the degree to which the Democratic Party fights any attempt to require ID for voting, which is preposterous, right? You have a population in which everybody has a cell phone. Yeah. The number of people who don't have an ID.
I get ID'd every day in America.
Right.
I never got ID'd in England. I don't understand why it's offensive.
Right. To the extent that their argument applies to anybody, it's, you probably count them on one hand.
Yeah.
But so anyway, you have a democracy or a democratic republic that has nuclear weapons, and you're not requiring people just to establish that they're actually citizens of the country before exerting the sacred right. I mean, it's insane. And yet the Democratic Party fights this stuff like something very important is riding on it. So I assume that their absurd position is a stand-in for a real position, which is that they are carving out the right to cheat in some way and that ID makes it harder to do. That's consistent. But no, I think there's some larger purpose to the influx of migrants, and not only are allowing it, but quite literally are facilitating it. It's absurd. It makes no sense from the point of view of the well-being of the American public, the well-being of the republic in the long term. It is, at one level or another, it's a hostile invasion being facilitated by, at the very least, our own executive branch. So what it's about, I don't know. I'm agnostic. It's possible that it's about multiple things, that there's some initial cause that produced the pattern, and then there's some secondary causes that have joined forces. But I don't know what it's about, and I think it's absolutely terrifying.
Kamala Harris has come up a couple of times in this conversation. How do you explain Kamala Harris to a foreigner like me? Is she an NPC in a jumpsuit? Is she someone who's actually very intelligent? She's Attorney General in California after all. Is she someone smart? Is she herself competent, formidable? You mentioned already that she's not really those things, but how would you explain it to someone who doesn't understand America at all?
It will be hard for somebody who doesn't understand America to understand what she is. But, she is the most extreme example of a figurehead that we have ever seen. There is, for whatever reason, and we can talk about what actually goes on inside this person's head and how they ended up where they are, but in her current state, she is an empty vessel whose qualifications are literally skin deep. That's what she is. And I am supposed to not be able to say that because it opens me up to accusations of racism or sexism or both.
So she's the DEI president, or vice president currently, possibly DEI president. I said it. You don't have to say it.
No, I'm happy to say it. I'm pre-canceled. But look, I am a lifelong liberal. I believe in egalitarianism. I don't believe that we need to have equal representation or proportionate representation across every industry by sex, by race, or anything like that. That's not how it works. But I do believe we are best off if opportunity is distributed as widely as possible and people get to choose how it is they want to live their lives. Kamala Harris is the worst possible insult to women and people of color that you can imagine. For her to be in a position to inhabit that office, having literally no qualifications that stand up to scrutiny, is it is evidence of the worst fever dreams of the right imaginable, that DEI is simply a Trojan horse in which people who can't do anything can ride their way all the way to the ultimate heights of power. So my feeling is, would I be cool with a woman president? Of course. Yeah. But I want her highly competent and patriotic, and this person is neither.
I've heard many women say the same thing. They don't want her they don't want her to be the first president of all. Yeah.
Right.
Women.
It's
embarrassing.
It is beyond embarrassing. It's horrifying that all, I mean, for one thing, say what you will about feminism, but somewhere before the insanity that we are currently living, feminism and liberalism accomplished something spectacular for which, if we didn't have to be so embarrassed about the present state of those ideas, we should be very proud. Women were literally successfully liberated so that they have the entire spectrum of opportunities available to them. Right? Women, Heather, my wife, frequently talks about the fact that she did not realize at the time that she was living in the golden age, that she literally didn't face any obstacles to doing anything she should want to do. And she made great use of those opportunities. Right? And so anyway, yes, women were liberated successfully, and humanity has benefited greatly. We are now suffering from some runaway process in which we are continually trying to liberate these liberated people. And that's a tragedy. But nonetheless, to have that success tarnished by this absurdity is, it's history trying to tell us something.
Yeah. This might seem like a niche question, but as you're talking there, I can't help but wonder, the Biden is clearly in cognitive decline. Why hasn't the 25th Amendment been invoked? Because then Kamala would be president. The Democrats she would enjoy the advantage of incumbency. Why is that not the case? I mean, if they really want to make her the first female president, go for it.
Well, I must say the simultaneous threat of removing Biden from office over his obvious mental decline, which frankly was obvious before he was elected. I was saying he was clearly compromised, and
her stupidity was clear to me, at least in 2020.
Yeah, they're both clear, which really is telling us something. I mean, this party really can't find a candidate that just superficially is
There's
more.
Tim Walz in the wings waiting.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid of his competence. But if you read what Seymour Hersh wrote about the events that led to Biden stepping out of the race, he was threatened with the 25th Amendment.
This is the Pelosi scandal.
Right. And to me, this is the worst possible indictment of Kamala Harris, that she would have threatened the president so that he would leave the race and not force him from the office means that this is pure politics, right? If he is incompetent enough that that threat will cause him not to stare it down, but to leave the race because he knows that they can carry through, but not to remove him from the office. At the same time, we're playing nuclear games with Russia in Ukraine. This is insane. We don't know who the president is. We know that the guy who's in the office is incompetent. We know that he was forced from office on the basis of that incompetence, and yet he's been left there as his own figurehead. We're all running the risk that he's going to get the call in the middle of the night, sir, Russians have launched a so-and-so. What do we do? Mm-hmm. This is not a risk that anybody on earth can afford for the Americans to be playing, and yet we are. So I find the fact that Harris did not force Biden from the presidency to be an indication that she is not fit for the job. In and of itself. Yeah. If she was highly competent and she had made that one error, I would say that invalidates her readiness for that position.
Yeah. Look, let's end on a positive. I've been very impressed by your Rescue the Republic movement. I tried my hardest to get down to your DC event. I think it was about a month ago.
September 29th.
September 29th. You had a whole cast of right and left conservatives and dissident liberals, you might call them. Many of the speeches went viral, especially Matt Taibbi's. I saw that everywhere. It seems to me that you have harnessed the populist energy from the left for where Bernie, who, as far as I can tell, Bernie, who was this populist leftist spearhead, rolled over and became an establishment shill at the snap of a finger, really, in supporting Hillary and continues to do so. I haven't quite got my head around Bernie. Perhaps you have insight there. But positively, what do people need to know about Rescue the Republic? What's next for you guys? What was your takeaway from the DC event?
Well, Rescue the Republic was post-partisan, non-ideological. It was our attempt to bring together the unity movement, this new coalition that is arising, so that it could get a sense for itself, right? That you could actually see people who really do represent the entire spectrum of ideologies gathering for common cause. Really, the original name for it was going to be Save the West. And ultimately, we decided that the threat to the Republic was so critical that it was really a rescue mission and that we needed to focus on the Republic. But I mean, you saw it was an international crew who showed up.
When you save America, you save the West, by the way. So,
well, that was our point. And I took up at the point that we changed the working title to Rescue the Republic. It was Rescue the Republic to Save the West, because the West will not endure if the Republic falls. So I think there are a number of purposes to gathering that unity coalition. One, it needs to be clear that the coalition exists and it is not synonymous with Trump. I think it is fair to say that most of the people in it are supportive of Trump because, frankly, we see a critical threat to the Republic on the other side, and we are hoping that Donald Trump will find skills he didn't find in his first term and turn the Republic around. But we have to be there to put pressure so that the Republic's interests are represented in this administration. And if Donald Trump, for whatever reason, because the deep state finds some leverage we don't know about, because he has an agenda we don't understand, if he doesn't do right by us in his administration, well, that movement is there
to hold him account.
To hold him to account and to demand that we do get back on track. So anyway, all of those reasons required us to have that gathering. And I also think, as I said in my speech, that to the extent that Americans are afraid to show up in their own capital and speak freely and seek redress of grievances, which is literally guaranteed by our first enumerated right.
People afraid?
Oh, they're terrified.
Is this a post-Jan 6th thing?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And, we had a great turnout. The event felt very full, but I think it was a fraction of the turnout that we would have had if lots of people had not felt like showing up there would cause them to be put on a list. In fact, many people told us this. It was probably
having the likes of Jordan Peterson, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Russell Brand, David Rubin. I mean, there's many more. That gave protective cover, right? It's kind of a critical mass.
Ron Johnson, a sitting senator.
Right.
So that was part of our purpose, was to effectively retake the Capitol for the people, to demonstrate that you could go and peacefully deliver a forceful message about what's wrong with America at the moment and live to tell the tale, which we successfully did. And we don't know how many, but we had many thousands of people on the ground. But that audience was dwarfed by the people who saw it live,
right,
where we had millions of people view it live. So anyway, it was tremendously successful. And I hope that whatever happens in the next few days, that people will remember that force is mighty and it belongs to no one. It's a force of the people.
So I see you guys in this movement as explicitly populist. You have these 8 pillars on your website, 8 different complexes, the military-industrial complex, the censorship-industrial complex, and on. And you are explaining how to take these apart, dismantle them. For me, that is populism. You recognize as an elite failure, and they need to be taken down. Now, we've talked a lot about that in this conversation about what Trump should do, let's say, should he take power. Do you consider yourself a populist? Is that a dirty word for you?
No, it's always been a little bit strange that it's a dirty word in any context, like it's an indictment of who you are. I think there are populists who are disappointing, and then there are other populists who are inspiring. I don't aspire to be a populist, but I'm a patriot. I believe that most Americans agree on the basics, and that, in fact, the more absurd our system becomes, the less reason there is for us to be arguing with each other. Until we solve the most fundamental problems, our ideological differences are unimportant, right? If the republic falls, our differences of opinion over tax rates or whatever are meaningless. So, in any case, I think there was a report when I first emerged into the public eye. I talked frequently about the Hidden Tribes Report, which had studied the American public and had discovered something that I had long suspected, which was you have 2 radical fringes, and then you have this vast group of Americans that agree on most stuff. Not perfectly, but close enough. Even the stuff we're supposed to not be able to see eye to eye on, stuff like abortion and things like that. Most Americans agree on it, right? There's no reason for us to be at each other's throats. We're just fed a slate of choices that forces us into these very extreme camps. So that vast, exhausted middle, as the Hidden Tribes Report described it, is really who Rescue the Republic is appealing to. And the amazing thing, which I'm certain you have seen in traveling in America and meeting with all of these people who are seeing the same picture, is that there is tremendous tolerance and increasingly tremendous diversity in this coalition of people. And the fact is, it really is the vision of what America is supposed to be, where what your skin color is, what your sex is, these things don't matter. If you're on board with, the basic idea that we should have opportunity be broadly distributed, and we should, compete to figure out what it is that we can contribute to the well-being of humanity, and we should be rewarded for doing so by the market. If you're pretty much on board with that idea, then, nobody looks twice at you about, what religion you have or, where your ancestors come from. It doesn't matter. If you're on board with the idea of the West, then we're cool with you. And so anyway, I'm thrilled to be a part of a movement that is living those ideals that most Americans believe are effectively sacred.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, those are the ideals of America and the founding fathers. So,
yep.
Fantastic. I love to end on a positive note. It rarely happens. So I would say thank you so much, Professor Weinstein. Is there any part of the conversation you think any loose ends we didn't tie up? Or it's such a vast, what we're talking about, there's so many, we could go to such depths that I suppose there's many loose ends and it's impossible to really ever close it all up. But is there anything important that you feel like we missed that are worth addressing?
No, I feel like we are all hovering in this, I'm going to resist saying anything about quantum superposition, but we have no idea what's about to happen. And it is interesting. I'm glad we captured this conversation at that moment where we really don't know, because we're about to find out one way or the other what story we're living. Yeah. And anyway, I look forward to picking up the loose ends in the next conversation.
That would be great. Professor Bret Weinstein, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show. That was Bret Weinstein. If you want to support the show, I remind you, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Professor Weinstein discussing the issues that you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.